walking you guys through the process of making bread. I've already got all my ingredients out here, so I'm going to go ahead and mix it.
In this video, I'm going to be doubling my bread recipe. So to this bowl, I'm adding 2 cups of water, 6 tablespoons of sugar, and 2 tablespoons of yeast, and I'm going to whisk that all together. The sugar just gives the yeast something to feed on, and you're going to wait on it to start to activate. Set the mixture aside for about 10 minutes or until you start to see the yeast get foamy. It should look like this, and then you're ready for the next step. Next, add 2 tablespoons of oil, 4 teaspoons of salt, and you're going to incorporate your flour slowly, but it is 4 cups, and you're going to want to work it in. It'll take a little bit for it to come together, and then just continue to pour in more and more until it forms a ball and starts to pull away from the sides of the bowl. Cover with a towel and set aside for about an hour or until it doubles in size.
So while we wait on this dough to rise, I figured I would answer some of the questions that I get most commonly asked about bread. And one of the biggest is wanting a healthy option for bread. And the way that I look at it is that the bread or whatever you're making is only going to be as healthy as the ingredients that you're putting into it. So when I'm making bread, I try and source the best ingredients that I can. Recently, within the last month, we've actually switched to organic flour. So the flour that I used in this today it's actually not bread flour, it's just an all-purpose organic flour. But honestly, I cannot tell a difference. And anytime that I'm making anything, I always just look at the ingredients and go down the list and try and make simple swaps. And I don't do it all at once. So if you're just getting started with wanting to eat simpler meals and trying to just live a more simple lifestyle, you don't have to do it all in one day at all, because one, it's nearly impossible to do. And also trying to find sources for healthier ingredients is not always easy, and honestly it's not been easy at all. So I always start with one ingredient, say honey. A lot of people want to swap out sugar for honey, and you totally can. Just look for a raw honey option instead of just your basic honey that you get from the store. And of course, once you put it in the bread and bake it, it's not going to be raw anymore, but at least you know previously that it was raw. Because a lot of the honeys that you get in the grocery store, they're actually cut down with sugar. So you're not even getting 100% honey. Usually it's cut with sugar. And then as far as like an oil goes, try swapping out for something a little bit healthier. And I like to use olive oil. We recently cut out all canola oil, so we don't even buy canola oil at all. But I know it is super popular. I get a lot of DMs asking if you can substitute olive oil for the canola oil, and you can do your own research on canola oil and why not to use it. And I actually have another bread recipe. I haven't shared it on the blog yet, but eventually I will. But in that recipe, I actually use lard in place of oil. So that is another option. If you have lard, you can always use lard in your bread also. And sugar in your bread is not bad, just as long as you're using a good quality ingredient. So we use organic cane sugar, and that's the only kind of sugar that we buy. So even whenever I'm making like powdered sugar and brown sugar, I don't buy those. I just make our own brown sugar out of the cane sugar, and then I'll also use it for powdered sugar. Whenever you're making bread, you do want to make sure that you have a good quality water. So we get water out of our Berkey and just heat it up on the stove, and that's how we get our hot water for the bread. Just because our tap water, I've talked about it before, it's really hard, and honestly, I have never even tasted the water here that hasn't been filtered, just because I've never heard good things about it. So in your bread, just use a good quality water. And as long as you're using good quality ingredients, then the bread is going to be way better than what you get in the store. Even if you are buying a sourdough option in the store, but just because you think it's a healthier option, if you turn over the bag and look at the list of ingredients, more than likely it is not even sourdough. Half the time it doesn't even contain sourdough at all. So you really have to look at the grocery store, because you're not always getting what you think you are. And especially for like breads, like that is such a long list of ingredients. I think there's 5 or 6 ingredients in this. In the store, there is like 20 ingredients. And if you turn it over, you don't even know what half of them are. And it's because they're additives and preservatives to make it have a longer shelf life. So that is the only downside to homemade bread, is it does only last about 7 days. But if you are a small family and you won't eat a whole loaf of bread in 7 days, because a lot of times me and Ben won't, then you can cut it in half whenever you bake it, and then stick the other half in the freezer and just pull it out whenever you need it. Another really common question I get is just talking about how their loaf was heavy or it just didn't turn out right. And there's a lot of reasons why your bread is not turning out right. So I started making bread about 4 years ago. It took me so long to learn how to make bread. So for probably 6 to 8 months, I was making loaves of bread and they were turning out awful every single time. A lot of the times that they would get made into croutons, or we would just have like toast or something, just because I didn't want to waste it. But it was not good enough to eat just like as sandwich bread. Just don't give up, just because it is kind of like a skill that you have to learn. And once you learn your dough and your flour, it becomes so much easier. I would always get so mad every time I would pull out a loaf of bread and it was bad, just because it is a lot of work and you're putting in probably like 3 hours. Just because if you're making a yeast loaf, then it does take about 3 hours on the rise times and bake time and everything like that. And you don't want all your work to be for nothing. But if you do have bad loaves of bread, just don't quit. Just keep trying, because it does get easier. If your loaf of bread comes out really heavy, like it's super dense, then more than likely you are using too much flour. So the next time, and it's all dependent on the kind of flour that you use. So if you're using like a spelt flour or like a whole wheat flour, whatever kind of flour you're using, you're gonna have to adjust your water. And some flours require more water and some require less. So you're just gonna have to play around with it a bit until you figure out your consistency. But if you are getting a heavy loaf of bread and the next time you're going to use the same exact kind of flour, then cut the flour by a 1/4 cup every time until you get the desired consistency that you want. So the next time you make it, instead of using 2 cups of flour, then cut it back to 1 3/4 cup. And just keep doing that until you get the consistency that you want. And if your bread is coming out wet on the inside, like super doughy, then you did not put enough flour. So you're gonna need to increase your flour the next time. So instead of adding 2 cups of flour, add in 2 1/4 cups. And I forgot to mention that I did make a double batch of bread, just because I'm gonna be using the Pullman Loaf, and it makes an actual like sandwich loaf size of bread. So this right here is a Pullman Loaf. And then this is just your normal bread loaf pan. So you can see the difference. The Pullman Loaf is way bigger. So I did make a double batch just so it would fill up this pan all the way. But if you're going to be making a loaf of bread this size, then follow the recipe that's going to be like linked down below. And I'll try and put the ingredients listed out in the description for this size loaf pan. And a lot of people are worried about the rise time and how long you have to let it rise for. And it is not particular to sourdough. Like, this is a yeast bread, so there's nothing to do with sourdough in this recipe. You do not have to let this sit overnight. It's quick, and you do 2 different rises. So you do one in the bowl for an hour or until it's doubled in size, and then you do one once your bread has been put in a loaf pan, and you do that for an hour or until it's doubled in size. The last question that I get a lot is, how do I cut my bread? And I just use a knife. So back in the beginning of this year, I ordered this, and it's actually a bread cutter. So you put your loaf down inside this, and it holds your bread in. I'll bring you closer. And it has these slits in it so that you can, there's like a really thick option, and then like a medium thickness, and then a thin. And it's supposed to help you cut. Here's a closer look at that bread cutter. So the edges fold up, and then you just put your loaf of bread in here, and your knife slides down through here. If you're worried about really consistent like slices of bread, then I would recommend this. But if you're not too worried about that, then I would just say use a knife, and use a really good sharp knife. So we keep our knives up here on this yellow cabinet, but we use the old hickory knives. This is the knife that I was talking about, and this is the knife that we use for our bread. And as you can see, it is carbon steel. So if you've never used carbon steel before, you're gonna think that this knife is just rusted and it's trash, but it's not. It's just how the blade is, and it does tarnish over time. But these are the best knives that we've found, and it's just a really thick blade, so it's easy to cut through the bread.
After the dough has doubled in size, you're going to turn out your dough onto a lightly floured surface and start to knead it. I'm not really particular with this part. You just want to make sure that you don't over knead it. I probably knead my dough about 10 times, and the dough should just feel super soft at this point. And anywhere that it sticks to the table, just add a little flour, and you're not trying to get rid of all the stickiness, because you do want it to be a little sticky still. That way you keep your moisture in your dough. Once you're done kneading your dough, go ahead and start shaping it into a loaf shape, and you're going to add it to a well-greased loaf pan, and you want it to be really greased. That is key here for getting out a good loaf of bread.
I just got the bread put in the loaf pan, and as you saw, I stabbed it with the fork, and I always don't do that. It's just whenever I remember to do it. And especially with sandwich bread, usually you'll get those big pockets after it's baked of like a hole in the bread or something like that. And poking the dough with a fork just helps to remove some of those air bubbles. So it is optional, and I do not do it every single time. I mostly do it whenever I just can remember to it.
It's been about an hour and you can see that it has rose, and you can let it go up higher if you want, but I don't, and I need to get this baked, but I'll be home in just a few minutes. So I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the oven, and we're gonna bake it at 350 for 30 minutes. And depending on your oven, you may want to check it out like 25 to 30, and depending on how dark of a crust you want.
So while the bread's baking, I did want to mention that you have to be careful. There's like a sweet spot. You can let your bread rise, and you can let it get a little bit higher than what it was in the pan, but you don't want to let it go too much because it will fall back down. And then you'll have to start the process all over. You have to punch it down and then also reshape it and let it re-rise in the dough in the pan. So you want to be careful not to let it rise too much. But I wanted to talk about how we store our bread, and I actually ordered these off of Amazon, and they've lasted us a really long time, but as you can see, they're pretty long, and it's a bread bag, and it's made specifically for bread, so it's the size of an actual like bread bag. And this does fit the Pullman Loaf, so the pan that I'm using, it fits like a full loaf size of bread. It does come with bread ties also, so you don't have to have that, but it's just easier for me to keep these on hand than to cut the loaf in half and then put half in a Ziploc bag and the other half in another Ziploc bag. Because even with the small loaf pan, I have a really hard time fitting a full loaf inside of a gallon freezer bag or gallon like Ziploc bag. This just makes things a lot easier. So whenever the bread is done baking, we're going to turn it out onto a like cooling rack. You don't have to have one, you can just dump it onto your counter. I just like to get mine out of the pan so that it cools evenly. And then once it's turned out of the pan, that's whenever I'll butter all the edges of it except for the bottom. And you don't have to butter the outside of your bread, it's completely optional. It just helps keep the bread from getting so hard on the outside, like crusty. It gives it that moisture back so that it's like a soft crust. But the hardest part is to not cut the bread whenever it's hot. You have to let it cool completely. I mean, if you're in a pinch, you can go ahead and cut it and serve it, but you want it to completely cool before you cut it just because it is still like cooking on the inside. So you really need to let it cool down to room temperature before you do anything with it. And before you put it in any kind of bag, you want it to be completely cooled. So all the way down to room temperature, even on the inside, just because if not, it'll make the bread sweat inside the bag and that'll cause mold.
So here's what the bread looks like on the inside, and it is still like, it feels wet right now just because it is still warm. So it will not feel like this whenever it is completely cooled, but we're about to eat dinner, so we're gonna eat this out. Typically you would at least let it cool for about an hour, but before we put this up, we will let it cool for an hour. That way it doesn't sweat in the bag.